China may have just forced the United States to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on concrete, power plants, transmission lines, cooling systems, and computer chips. That sounds like an unusual response to an artificial intelligence challenge, but it tells you exactly how much the competition has changed. For years, America's advantage looked comfortable. The biggest AI companies were American. The most important AI chips were designed by American firms. U.S. companies had access to enormous amounts of capital and computing power. Then Chinese developers started showing that the gap could close much faster than Washington expected. DeepSeek was the warning. It was followed by a broader wave of increasingly competitive Chinese models. By 2026, Stanford's AI Index concluded that the performance gap between leading American and Chinese models had effectively closed, with models from the two countries trading the lead at different points since early 2025. And that created a difficult problem for the United States. If China can build highly capable AI despite restricted access to the best chips, then simply denying China hardware will not preserve an American lead. If Chinese models are cheap and openly available, having the most advanced proprietary model may not guarantee global dominance either. Washington's response is becoming much bigger than another chatbot. America is trying to build an entire industrial system around AI. More computing power, more electricity, more domestic chip capacity, faster construction, selective restrictions on China, and a global market built around American technology. That is America's answer to China's AI push. And whether it works depends on something much harder than inventing a better model. It depends on whether the United States can build fast enough. DeepSeek mattered because of what it suggested about efficiency. American AI development had increasingly followed a capital-intensive formula. Larger clusters of advanced GPUs, enormous training runs, huge data centers, and billions of dollars in investment. China faced a constraint. U.S. export controls limited access to the most advanced AI chips. The expectation was straightforward. Restricting high-end compute would slow Chinese developers and preserve more technological distance between the two countries. It did create constraints, but it also gave Chinese companies a powerful incentive to squeeze more performance from the hardware they could obtain. DeepSeek demonstrated techniques that help produce frontier-level results with greater computational efficiency. Chinese developers also leaned aggressively into open-weight releases, allowing companies and researchers around the world to download, modify, and deploy their models themselves. And DeepSeek increasingly looks less like an isolated event. Stanford's 2026 AI Index says China now leads the United States in areas including AI publication volume, citations, patent output, and industrial robot installations, even while the United States continues to produce more top-tier models and retains important advantages in high-impact patents and infrastructure. That distinction matters. China does not have to dominate every part of artificial intelligence to create a serious strategic challenge. It needs models that are good enough, inexpensive enough, and accessible enough that businesses, developers, universities, and governments outside the United States consider using them. That moves the competition beyond benchmark scores. It becomes a competition over adoption, and America's strategy now reflects that. In July 2025, the White House released America's AI Action Plan. The document organized federal policy around three broad priorities: accelerate AI innovation, build American AI infrastructure, and expand American AI internationally while addressing security threats. The second part deserves much more attention than it usually receives, because AI development is becoming constrained by physical resources. Advanced models require chips. Those chips need giant data centers. Data centers need networking equipment, transformers, substations, and cooling. Above all, they need electricity. So part of America's answer to Chinese AI development is essentially a massive infrastructure program driven largely by private companies, with Washington trying to remove obstacles that could slow it down. A July 2025 executive order directed federal agencies to accelerate permitting for qualifying large-scale data center projects and related infrastructure. The order specifically covers facilities requiring more than 100 megawatts of new power for AI workloads and includes supporting infrastructure ranging from transmission equipment to semiconductor components. That is an extraordinary amount of power for a single computing site. And increasingly, 100 megawatts is not considered particularly large by the standards of the projects now being proposed. Some AI campuses are moving into the gigawatt range. That leads directly to Stargate. When OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle, and their partners announced Stargate in January 2025. The initial commitment was up to $500 billion over 4 years for AI infrastructure in the United States. The project began with plans to deploy $100 billion and build massive computing campuses starting in Texas. By September 2025, OpenAI said Stargate-related projects had reached nearly 7 gigawatts of planned capacity and more than $400 billion of expected investment over 3 years. Then the target kept growing. In April 2026, OpenAI said it had already secured more than 10 gigawatts of U.S. AI infrastructure, surpassing the capacity goal announced the previous year, and that it was evaluating additional sites across the country. 10 gigawatts is important because AI leadership is increasingly tied to how many high-end accelerators a company can connect, power, and operate reliably. Algorithms still matter enormously. Talent matters. Data matters. But if 2 laboratories have similarly strong researchers and one can deploy dramatically more compute, that difference can affect how many experiments it runs, how quickly it trains new systems, and how widely it can serve those systems once they are released. America is trying to turn its advantage in capital markets, cloud computing, and advanced chip design into a much larger compute advantage. The challenge is supplying the electricity. The International Energy Agency expects global data center electricity consumption to more than double by 2030. The United States is projected to account for the largest part of that increase, and the IEA estimates data centers could represent nearly half of all growth in American electricity demand through the end of the decade. That changes AI policy. For decades, American electricity demand grew relatively slowly. Now utilities in some regions are receiving requests for gigantic new industrial loads on timelines that the existing grid was never designed to accommodate. A company may have the money for GPUs. It may have the land. It may have the building permits. But without sufficient generation and transmission capacity, those machines cannot run. The U.S. Department of Energy acknowledged exactly this problem in its 2025 Speed to Power initiative, saying large proposed data centers and manufacturing facilities were creating multi-gigawatt demand increases while grid congestion, aging infrastructure, and long interconnection timelines threaten the development of those projects. So AI companies are becoming deeply involved in energy. Developers are looking at natural gas, nuclear power, renewables, storage, and new transmission. Some projects are being designed with dedicated generation rather than waiting entirely for existing utility capacity. This is one area where China has an important structural advantage. China has spent decades rapidly expanding electricity generation, transmission, and industrial infrastructure. The U.S. AI Action Plan itself explicitly identifies American energy capacity and construction speed as weaknesses relative to China, which means America can possess the world's most valuable chip companies and still run into a very basic bottleneck: getting enough electrons to the GPUs. Then there are the chips themselves. The United States remains exceptionally strong in semiconductor design. American companies occupy crucial positions in AI accelerators and the broader technology stack. But advanced semiconductor manufacturing has remained heavily concentrated in Asia. Stanford's 2026 AI Index highlights the vulnerability clearly. The United States hosts more AI data centers than any other country, while leading AI chips still depend heavily on fabrication by TSMC. Domestic TSMC production in Arizona began adding some geographic diversification in 2025, but the supply chain remains highly concentrated. That is why semiconductor manufacturing is part of the AI strategy as well. America wants more fabrication capacity at home while maintaining its advantage in chip design and semiconductor equipment. At the same time, Washington continues trying to limit the transfer of strategically important computing technology to China. But the policy has become more complicated. In 2025, the Commerce Department scrapped the previous administration's broader AI diffusion rule, while maintaining and strengthening controls targeted at Chinese advanced computing capabilities and potential diversion. Then in January 2026, Commerce revised the rules again, allowing applications for exports of NVIDIA, H200S, AMD MI 325X chips, and comparable processors to approved Chinese customers to be reviewed case by case under specific security conditions. That tells you something important about the American strategy. Washington is trying to balance two goals that can conflict. It wants to slow China's access to strategically important technology, but it also wants American companies to remain the dominant global suppliers. Restrict exports too little, and Chinese labs gain additional computing capacity. Restrict them too broadly, and China has an even stronger incentive to replace American technology entirely, while other countries search for alternatives. There's no simple setting on that dial. The less obvious part of the U.S. strategy concerns everyone outside China and America. The White House AI Action Plan explicitly calls for exporting what it describes as the American full AI technology stack: hardware, models, software, applications, and standards. The idea is to encourage allies and partners to build their AI infrastructure around American systems rather than Chinese ones. This may eventually matter as much as who produces the number one model. Imagine a company building an AI system in Southeast Asia, Europe, Latin America, or the Middle East. It needs chips, cloud infrastructure, models, developer tools, cybersecurity, technical standards, financing, potentially an entire data center. If American companies provide most of those pieces, that country becomes deeply connected to the American technology ecosystem. China understands the same dynamic. Its advantage is often price, infrastructure experience, manufacturing depth, and increasingly capable open models. That is why open-weight AI has become strategically important. A government or company may prefer a model that can operate locally instead of sending sensitive information to a foreign cloud provider. Chinese developers have been extremely aggressive in serving that demand. The United States noticed. America's AI Action Plan specifically calls for supporting competitive American open-weight models and increasing access to computing resources for researchers and startups. That is a direct response to one of the strongest elements of China's AI strategy. Because the model that wins global adoption may not always be the model with the absolute highest benchmark score. Cost, control, customization, and availability matter too. The American strategy has enormous resources behind it. The United States has world-leading AI laboratories, dominant chip designers, hyperscale cloud companies, deep capital markets, elite universities, and a large base of global technology partners. It also already has far more data center infrastructure than any other country. Stanford estimates more than 5,400 data centers are located in the United States, over 10 times the count of any other individual country. But scale alone does not guarantee victory. China has already demonstrated the value of efficiency. If Chinese laboratories continue getting more capability from less hardware, every dollar they spend on compute becomes more effective. The second risk is electricity. Hundreds of billions of dollars in planned computing infrastructure means very little if power projects, transmission lines, and substations arrive years late. The third risk is cost. If American frontier AI becomes extremely capable but remains expensive and concentrated among a handful of companies, cheaper open alternatives may spread faster internationally. And then there is policy instability. Semiconductor restrictions, permitting rules, energy policy, and international technology agreements can change with political priorities. Companies building facilities expected to operate for decades need much longer planning horizons. China faces major challenges of its own, including semiconductor restrictions, dependence on some foreign technologies, economic pressures, and the difficulty of sustaining frontier development at enormous scale. But Washington can no longer plan around the assumption that Chinese AI will remain several years behind. The evidence no longer supports that assumption. So strip away the speeches, announcements, and huge investment numbers, and America's strategy comes down to a specific bet. The United States believes it can combine private sector competition with infrastructure at unprecedented scale. Build more advanced chips. Manufacture more of the critical supply. Give American companies easier access to allied markets. And keep American models, both proprietary and open, competitive enough that the world chooses them voluntarily. The real prize is influence over the infrastructure on which millions of companies and eventually entire economies operate. And that is why one of the most important developments in artificial intelligence right now is happening far away from a chatbot window. It is happening where utilities are planning new generation, where semiconductor fabs are being constructed, where hyperscalers are negotiating for gigawatts of electricity, where governments are deciding whose chips, models, and technical standards their companies will use. America's response is to make its advantage much harder to measure with a single benchmark. It is trying to create more compute than its competitors, connect that compute to a much larger energy system, control critical parts of the semiconductor stack, and distribute American AI across the global economy. That is an extremely expensive strategy. It is also already under construction. And over the next few years, the key measure of America's AI position may not be which company releases the smartest model on a Tuesday morning. Watch the chips being manufactured. Watch the gigawatts being connected. Watch which models developers around the world actually choose. Because that is where the US-China AI competition is being decided.